bridge collapsed. The mountain road washed out. All the signs are obscured by fog. Your only directions are detours. Eventually it dawns on you. Sometimes you need to get lost to discover where you're supposed to be. Welcome to Merlin's Barn.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Merlin's Barn. Sitting down here in the old livestock office, staring at the slowly darkening sky, and the neighbor's garden, which is finally planted, where the heavy rains have been falling and the tomato plants are starting to grow, and never totally figured out what he does. But number one, the rabbits seem to stay away, and we have tons of rabbits. Number two, these are some of the largest tomatoes I've ever seen. And the most glorious sandwich that you can have is made from this garden. You get one of these big tomatoes. You go up to Hallbaugh's orchard north of Gettysburg and you pick up some really nice, thick bacon. It's a religious experience in itself. And then you either make some nice Irish soda bread or you get some sourdough bread. You cook that all up, toast the bread, and you have a sandwich that can't be beat anywhere. So as I'm continuing recording, I'm going to keep watching that garden and thinking about my summer sandwiches. I hope you all have wonderful things going on in your world. Tonight or today, or this morning, whenever you are, I'm evening, we're going to talk about New Hampshire. And I spent years of my life traveling to New Hampshire. My grandparents lived in a little town called Kingston on the southern edge of New Hampshire, and my favorite teacher, David Hughes, ran a summer camp called Masquebec Hill up on Newfound Lake. And Masquebec Hill was a wonderful experience. It was this little log cabin that he built for himself as a family retreat, and a big mountainside going up behind it. It was in a strange little small town, and I'll talk about some of the quirks of that little town this evening. Things like, well, y'all can't get that from here, and the other New Englandisms. And there were places that Dave would take us on trips. A lot of people who know New Hampshire probably know of Clark's Trading Post. We actually only went there a couple times. That's a wonderful place I'll delve into in a later episode. He would take us to Ruggles Mine, which, if they reopen it, I don't know if I'd actually go there, because when I was there as a kid, it was much deeper, and you could just go in and explore all of the old mica mines. And unfortunately, one year we went back, and all of a sudden the mine was much smaller because they'd filled in a lot of it for insurance reasons, because America, land of the lawsuit. So I haven't been back since because I want to hold those childhood memories. And another neat place that Dave would take us was a little town called Warren, New Hampshire. This was a remote rural town that had two very interesting things in it. It had the Morse Museum, which was this beautiful river rock building constructed from river rock that looked like one of the Carnegie libraries you'd see plopped in little towns throughout the United States. And it had a redstone rocket. These were the things that they made ICBMs out of, that they launched the Gemini mission off of, things like that. Two strange little things to find in a small New Hampshire town. So, first off, the Morse Museum. The Morse Museum always stands out in my mind because we'd take a trip. We'd usually go to maybe Ruggles Mine, and then we would head up to Warren, and the Morse Museum, Dave would pull in first it was the Blue Bomber, which was this massive old GM diesel station wagon that survived everything from catching on fire to a tree falling on it. At one point we were thinking of using it as a water tank during a drought, but that would have been a little bit gross. Eventually Dave had a minivan, so we'd all travel in that. It wasn't a big camp. I mean, we might have maybe 20 kids at a time, so we'd take out groups. At the Morse Museum, we'd pull up, and you'd walk up onto the porch, and there'd be a big gong. And I remember ringing the gong and that would bring Mr. Morse's son to the door, and he would say hello and let us in. And this was a collection of oddities and interesting items and taxidermy and Egyptian mummies and shoes. Of all things, shoes from all over the world. So let's delve a little bit into what created this, because it was as I was thinking about doing this episode that it was like, well, who was the guy who made this, and why was this strange little museum out in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire? So I started reading and doing some research, and I found that Ira Morse was the fellow who built the museum, and this was a man who grew up in the town of Warren, New Hampshire. And his exposure to the outside world when he grew up was a book peddler who would come through town. And he would appear a couple times a year, and young Ira would choose books from his cart, his wagon, whatever it was. This is the 1800s. Ira was born in 1875. And the books he chose were things like Stanley in Africa and Hero of the Dark Continent, and he got really interested in traveling to Africa and in the African explorers. And eventually, after 8th grade, he left school and went to work first at a general store, and then he went into a department store, and eventually went into business for himself in his early 20s. Soon he had a chain of shoe stores. And this is really the sort of American. So this is the self-made man story, because he comes from this little farm in Warren, New Hampshire, and builds up from being a clerk to finding stores going out of business, buying them, building them up, and that's how he builds this chain. And this is where he makes his money. And by the early 1900s, Ira had enough money that, I mean, at that time, if you had an automobile, you were somebody with money. I mean, say like 1909 when he does a cross-country trip, that's before the Model T had really kicked into action. That was before Ford had gone and made the car affordable enough and maintainable enough by the village blacksmith so that the average person could have one. So one of his first big trips is in 1909, Ira, his wife, and a mechanic, because you needed a mechanic to travel with you, drove coast to coast in a Pope Hartford car. This is no easy feat at the time. It took them May to October to make it to the West Coast and back. And from there, he went on to do all sorts of other journeys around the world. And in the 1920s, Ira began big game hunting and really getting into his world travel. And during this time, he amassed a massive collection. He was sort of trying to build himself on the Teddy Roosevelt ideal. And he amassed this eclectic collection that ranged from shoes of different cultures. I mean, he would embarrass his family by like literally buying the shoes off of somebody on the street if he was in another country, because they interested him. An extension, of course, of the business that he had built. The game that he killed, he stuffed and sent home. He sent back Egyptian mummies, statues, carvings, different types of temple gongs. There's this one from, I think, Nepal, that was a bowl that you sort of drew the wooden mallet around, and the sound was absolutely transfixing. And he picked up whatever else caught his eye. And then he realized that he had this massive collection of stuff, and he wasn't doing anything with it. So in 1928, after constructing it from River Rock, he opened the Morse Museum in Warren, New Hampshire, and it displayed his wide-ranging collection. And while it may seem to the modern eye very politically incorrect, maybe a rich guy just showing off the massive amount of stuff that he had collected, you have to think about back then, when he grew up in this little town, his exposure to the outside world was a book peddler. In 1928, we didn't have television. Radio was just becoming a thing in the 1920s. And in a rural area like Warren, New Hampshire, there likely was not electricity run to the town yet. So if you had a radio, you had to have a home generator, which some farms had. You had to have batteries that you could charge to run the radio. So just to get that exposure to the outside world was not anywhere near what we have nowadays, where we can literally just click our phone and find a show or find an article. So bringing all these things back made it such that people in this rural area, people who traveled to it, could have an exposure to the outside world. How many rural villages had mummies? How many cities had mummies? How many rural folks at the time in the country were able to see what a lion looked like close up? I mean, maybe they could see a photograph or an engraving in a book. And in an era decades before the internet, this museum was what brought the world home. You can see photos of the museum online, and you can read more about it, and I'll put links in the show notes. I'll also include a link to a real estate listing that shows the inside of the museum now because it closed in the early 90s, which may be better for the fact that it didn't really survive long into the political correctness era. There was an auction and the items were sold off, and I have absolutely no idea where they all went. And believe me, I've looked and delved. Um, you can go to the town, you can see the outside of the museum. I'm not sure. There was a fish pond behind it where you could actually walk up to an old sort of gumball dispenser and put your money in and get a handful of food so that you could feed what I believe were probably trout in the lake, in the pond there. But something you can still see in the town is the Redstone rocket. And this isn't just a little rocket. This is a massive rocket embedded in concrete in the center of the town. Now, Redstone Arsenal is in Alabama. So the next question is, why does this little town in New Hampshire have a very nicely maintained Redstone rocket? And why and how? Well, apparently a resident of the town was stationed at the Redstone Arsenal. And as I mentioned earlier, the Redstone rockets were used for intercontinental ballistic missiles. They were used for our NASA launches, like the Gemini project, things like that. I think they used one to send the first astronauts into space. And the fellow from the town was Sergeant Ted Asselin. And I apologize if I just killed his name. It's Asselin. And when he was stationed at Redstone in Alabama, he saw they had a bunch of demilled rockets, so all the guts had been removed and everything like that. And he asked if he could have one. And, well, this being the early 70s, they said sure. So with the help of friends and a 60-foot truck, just imagine the length of that. That's actually longer than this barn is. No, it's almost the length of this barn. The barn is 45 by 80 feet. With the help of the friends and a truck, the rocket was slowly moved to Warren by 1971, where a large crane hoisted it into position. There was sort of a love-hate thing going on with it at that point because there were residents that were afraid. I mean, you got to think back, we're in the Cold War. This is back in the era where you're being taught duck and cover and hide under your desk in case there's a nuclear attack because that's going to do something. And so some people worried that having that there would all of a sudden make it would be something that the Russians would notice and would make this little town a target. Luckily, it didn't. Luckily, we never had a nuclear attack, and the rocket has stayed. So it's maintained, it's painted, and it's used for science STEM education at the local school. So one of the things you can do if you go up to the gorgeous glacial lake of Newfound Lake in New Hampshire, is you can head up to Warren, New Hampshire, and get yourself a photograph with that Redstone rocket standing in that little town, and then swing by where the Morse Museum used to be. It's worth it just to get the photo with the Redstone rocket. Now, living up there in the town was an interesting experience because we got to experience some rural New Hampshire living, and very much was the fit in the old adage, the old stereotypes of general stores with old men sitting out on the porch and Cracker Barrels and the stereotypical asking for directions and well, you can't get that from here. Uh, and the locals all called all the tourists flatlanders because they came from Massachusetts, where the mountains are absolutely nothing like the Great White Mountains in New Hampshire. We were near the town of Bristol. One of my favorite things in Bristol was we would go down there once a week to do the laundry, and we would be given an allowance. And there was a store in Bristol where there was a big candy counter, so we'd go in and get our candy, and then we'd go explore the town. There was this wonderful little junk shop that was in this old garage and lean-to next to a house, and we usually find some treasures in there. He had a neat old race car tucked away in the back uh, that had no roof, and I always loved the joke underneath the door that just said air conditioned. The old fellow who ran that went to the local dump one day and found a Model T truck. It had just been dropped at the dump, and he asked if he could have it, and gave them. They won $25, so he gave them $25, and I remember several years just seeing that old Model T truck just running around town as apparently his daily driver. He got it home, fixed a couple things, and just got it going again. We were up the lake a little ways, and we had an interesting experience, sort of a Barney Fife experience, where we had a sheriff, and he had a Ford Crown Victoria, and he loved to chase tourists up and down the lake. And then one year, the town decided that maybe it would be a good idea if they bought the sheriff a Ford Explorer, I think it was, something that could go off-road since most of the roads in the town were dirt and up a mountainside. Well, the sheriff, in a childish fit, quit because he couldn't chase tourists as well with that anymore. And once he quit, when he quit, that left his deputy with the Crown Victoria, the Ford Explorer, and his little red station wagon with an orange gumball light on top, which presented a problem that his wife described to some people in town, because what would happen is if you called him, the first decision that he would make is what car he was going to take. And he would go outside, he would stare, he would hem, he would haw, he'd finally choose the car, and then the next issue would be finding the keys to said car. And this could take an hour in itself. And by the time he found the keys to the car and headed up to use an Alice's Restaurant's term, quote, scene of crime, unquote, and then he would usually have forgotten his badge. And he refused to we recognized who he was, but he refused to do anything without his badge. So that would he would turn around and head on back home. So it was easier to solve problems amongst yourselves. And we learned about this when we found out, when we had an issue where parents had been trying to call the camp and then nobody could get through. And then parents were trying to get a hold of anybody in the area. And finally, there were two fire departments arguing over who we actually belonged to. And eventually one day, the fire department rolled in and came into a fireman walked into the hallway of the camp and saw the phone was off the hook, hung it back up, and all of a sudden the parents started calling. And Dave pulled in a couple minutes after to see the fire truck and wonder what had happened this time. And we had to explain to the parents that the phone had been off the hook and nobody had died of an axe murder or anything like that. And that was when we learned about our wonderful Barney Fife. We had other wonderful things. We had, apparently, according to Dave Lore, which is what I'll call the stories from Dave Hughes, we had a town hall up on the top of the mountain. And once a month, they'd get a road grader. And they would come in with the road grader, grade the road so the selectmen could get up there. And this fellow would sit at the top of the mountain. Nobody would come up there all day. And he'd get really annoyed and leave by the end of the day. And this would just go on every month. There really wasn't anybody regularly up there. Not only did we have the town hall on the top of the mountain, we had a library that was around the backside of the mountain. And with the condition of the roads, it was not easy to get to because you would have to either drive these loose gravel roads to get up over the top of the mountain, or you could drive 45 minutes to an hour around the mountain to get to the library. And according to Dave Lore, once again, the library was so inaccessible that there were two ladies who ran it who basically sat in there all day playing board games and cards and stuff like that. Despite all this, it was a really neat place to spend the summers. From waking up in the morning and throwing yourself in this beautifully clear lake to heading up into the hills and walking through a valley filled with black-eyed Susans to get up to the mountaintop and walk old roads that were kept mowed by another camp and find Revolutionary War era graveyards. Last little note on the lake itself, Dave would tell stories about every now and then if a bad storm came in, there would be maybe a door would float up. And that was from the namesake of the camp. The camp was called Masquebec Hill. And Masquebec Hill, when you pulled into the camp driveway, there was an old stone foundation to your right heading up the hill to the camp. And that is where the old Masquebec Hill Hotel was. And apparently a group of investors bought it sometime early 1900s. They wanted to move it to a point out in the lake. And this wasn't an uncommon thing to do back in that time period, where you would just put a building onto logs, like hewn round like telephone poles, and hitch some oxen up and move them. You find whole areas farther north when you get into Canada where whole towns have been moved from one location to another due to the mining drying up or things like that. And so one winter they waited until they thought that the ice was thick enough and started to roll the hotel out onto the lake. And the ice cracked as they got partway out towards the point. They managed to cut the oxen free and get them out of the way, and the hotel just went straight through the ice and sank to the bottom of the lake. It was always one of my goals was to figure out a way to go up there and dive and see if I could find the thing. And I don't know if scuba diving is top of my list right now, nor is jumping out of an airplane, which another friend of mine wants me to do. I'm very, very keen on the ground, and I like it. It's nice. I like to stay on it. So those are just a few starter stories from Newfound Lake, New Hampshire, spending time up there. I'm sure I'll have many more come to mind that will pop up in further episodes. And I want to say thank you very much for listening. And should you listen to this and something makes you think of a story or a place you've been or a quirky museum or store or town that you've found and people that you've met, please send those stories in because we'd like to make this into a community discussion. So you can send those you can contact us on Instagram, Merlin's Barn, MERLINS BARN. You can message me there. If you want to send something longer, then what I recommend is sending it to our email address, which is merlinsbarn@gmail.com. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and go out there, take a detour, experience something new, and share it with us. Thank you for listening.